welcome you to History Author Talks. And tonight's episode, we've got some terrific authors. I'm really pleased that you're joining us this evening. And I would love to now just remind you that as you listen to the show, we hope that you will send questions to me via the chat feature. So if you look down at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says chat, and you will hit that icon. Once you hit that icon, you can send a little message to me and ask whatever question you want to ask. I will then forward it to our guest host, who I'll introduce in a moment. And at the end of each of the authors' presentations, we will move into a question and answer period. So we look forward to having you ask us a lot of questions. And I also would like to remind you that our authors' books and many other fine books on the American Revolution are going to be available at the Fort Plain Museum Bookstore, who is our partner in history tonight. And I will be providing you with the link for the Fort Plain Museum bookshop. And as it so happens, our guest host tonight is Brian Mack from the Fort Plain Museum. So with that, I would like to turn the show over now to our guest host, Brian Mack.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you for having me on the program, and thank you for supporting the Fort Plain Museum. We at the Fort Plain Museum, we have a lot of things going on. I know you mentioned our bookstore. We also have a couple conferences coming up in 2021. Our annual American Revolutionary War Conference will hopefully be back this June, as well as a new Sir William Johnson and Empires at War. That's going to be all about the French and Indian War and stuff pretty much stuff prior to the Revolution. And that's going to be held middle October. If you go to our website, fortplainmuseum.com, everything's there, from our bookstore to our conferences to when we're open and all that good stuff. So again, thank you for all the support. And so without further ado, we'll get started with our program. I'd like to introduce James Kirby Martin. He is the author or editor of 14 books, including the recently released Insurrection, the American Revolution and its Meaning. He has also written Benedict Arnold, Revolutionary Hero, and American Warrior Reconsidered. Also, he's written a book on Forgotten Allies, the Oneida Indians in the American Revolution. And he's got a ton of other good books that I really enjoy. So you can check that out in the About the Author and 10 Key Campaigns book. Jim has taught at Rutgers University, the University of Houston, the Citadel, and also at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He has served on boards such as Fort Ticonderoga. I believe he is also the historian consultant for the Oneida Indian Nation of New York. And currently he became a board member of the Fort Plain Museum. So we're glad to have his expertise and all that on our museum board, and we're glad to have him. So without further ado, I'll introduce Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. First of all, let me say hello to the audience. You're all over my screen, which is great. I can see you, hopefully smiling, ready for what will be hopefully a very useful and conversation about aspects of the American Revolution. Now, my assignment actually grows out of an essay that I wrote for this volume. I'll hold it up. I think it has, if it hasn't been held up already, 10 Key Campaigns of the American Revolution. I wrote an essay about the Saratoga campaign of 1777. In this campaign was probably, from my point of view, one of, if not the most crucial of the whole Revolutionary War, because it led to the defeat of a British army, and that's really what this essay, what this story is all about. But I thought what we might do is start back in 1775 and very quickly review what really has occurred. And as we know, the revolution gets going on the 19th of April of 75. The battles at Lexington and Concord. This will lead to the beginning of a shooting war And before a month has passed, that war will actually spread into the Lake Champlain area, upstate New York, and lead to one of the great adventures of the Revolutionary War, which is the attempt by military forces under the command of a variety of individuals. You probably have heard of Ethan Allen. You probably have heard of Benedict Arnold. May well have heard of Philip Schuyler. And these individuals, without going into the detail of the story, will actually lead a campaign to bring Canada, or more specifically Quebec province, into the Revolution as the 14th colony in rebellion. And this is a very, very important move. I mean, George Washington is going to come, will be commissioned commander-in-chief. He'll go to Boston. He'll arrive in early July of 75 after the battles of the Battle of I just forgot which we're talking about, so I'll keep going. And the Battle of Bunker Hill. But anyway, the big story from my point of view isn't so much holding the British down in the Boston area as it is trying to conquer Canada. And by the end of 1775, it's looking good, because one of the armies that goes to Canada has conquered and captured Montreal, and the other army going through the Maine wilderness under Benedict Arnold, Colonel Benedict Arnold, is on the verge of capturing and taking Quebec City. And this is so very important, because if Quebec City is captured, that will be a very, very significant move, because from a operational point of view, the British will have to drive the Americans back out of Canada, back through that New York corridor, if they actually want to hope to put down this rebellion and bring it to an end. Well, what's going to happen at the end of 1775? Everything falls apart. There's a major battle late in the evening or early in the morning of July I'm getting my date straight, December 31st, and it's a disaster failure. The American general in charge, Richard Montgomery, is killed. Arnold is seriously wounded. And then let me wrap it up. The Americans, during the spring of 1776, will be driven out of Canada. So this campaign will be a colossal failure. Now, this is very, very important, though, because it affects, and one of the things I'm interested in studying military history, it affects overall military strategy in terms of what the Brits figure they have to do to win the war. And the plan is very simple. The plan is basically this. We're going to try to divide the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies by taking control of the Lake Champlain Hudson River corridor. We're going to move a force into New York City. We're going to move another force into Canada. We'll drop one out of Canada. We'll bring one up out of New York City. We'll gather in the area of Albany, New York. We'll sweep eastward, and we'll knock out the rebellion in the New England colonies. That's the overall strategy. Well, let me wrap this up. 1776, it's a failure. The British do not affect their strategy. And one of the reasons they fail is that their generals don't know how to work together, I guess is the way to put this. And one of the armies will end up really going after Washington in the New York area. The other British army will drop out of Canada. And that army will run into a fleet commanded on Valcour at the location of Valcour Island on Lake Champlain. And that fleet under the command of Benedict Arnold. I mean, this guy could fight on land, he could fight on sea. That battle turns out to be a disaster. He loses most of the vessels, Arnold does, but it delays the British. Very, very important to this story, because it delays the British. They will, in October and November, late October and November 1776, they will retreat back into Canada, and they will begin to plan the campaign for 1777. I believe the title of our presentation has something to do with the year of the hangman. You can think of those sevens as as nooses, or we're going to hang people on them. The Americans are going to be hanged, but it's not going to turn out that way. And one of the reasons it doesn't is General John Burgoyne. It's really what I'm trying to get around to, and understanding what the Brits are up to. And so Burgoyne does participate in the 1776 campaign. He comes to America in May of 1776. He'll be involved in the fighting, in 75. He'll be involved in the fighting around Boston. And he comes with what we might call the bad attitude. One of the worst things you can do in any situation, let alone in military campaigning, is to underrate your enemy. And Burgoyne is sort of a master at that. Let me get in, and I'll just take those colonists and I'll show them. They're inferior beings. They're outlanders. They're really not up to British standards. They can't stand up to mass British fire. Bad attitude. And so he'll bring that attitude again in 1776, and they'll move him into Canada, where he will be second in command under Guy Carleton, the governor of Quebec province. And so Burgoyne will participate in that campaign to drive across Lake Champlain and ultimately get to Albany, which is a failure. And he believes that the problem is that Carleton just doesn't have the chutzpah to get the job done. The problem is he doesn't understand how weak and feeble the Americans are, underrating his opponent. The problem is that he's not in charge. And so that will be what will bring him into our story front and center as the great gambler that I describe in my essay in the 10 Key Campaigns volume, and that he will come in and it will come with this gambling attitude. One of the things I try to do in history is take the individuals who are in command and are in charge and consider their character, to consider their values. And if you know anything about Burgoyne, he was the great gambler. This is a man who's now approaching his mid-50s. He's married well in England. He has become a member of high society in London. He has wonderful connections, and one of them is to the gambling table. And he does gamble. He loves to gamble. It's the sport of the great gentleman. And he is a great loser on the gambling table. He gambled away more than one fortune. I'm not sure how many in the end, but more than once, he sort of wiped himself out financially at the gambling table. And that's part of his characteristic. I'm going to take a great gamble, and to try to move an army all the way across Canada from Quebec to Montreal, and to drop that army of 8,000 down through Lake Champlain is nothing but a great military gamble. And so that's what Burgoyne's going to do. And he thought, well, we can get through. We have no problem. Look what we did in 1776. No problem getting to Fort Ticonderoga, even they didn't overrun it in 76. And so basically, this is where we stand. Burgoyne, the gambler, is really unfamiliar with the terrain beyond Fort Ticonderoga, and his army is going to get hung up, and it's going to be defeated. And one of the reasons is Benedict Arnold, who happens to be there again in 1777. He's a major general at this point in the Continental Army, and he is ready to take on and to defy the British, and especially John Burgoyne. So we have the gambler up against the future trader, if you want to put it that way. But at this point, Arnold is a good, loyal American. And I want to cut it there, Brian, and let you I'm sorry, I'm cutting you off. I don't mean to do that. Questions?
Well, I guess, do you think it's because Benedict Arnold played such a central role in the Northern campaigns? Are there any possibly other reasons? Like, I guess, what kind of role did he play, if you want to get further into it?
Well, one thing you learn about Arnold in terms of his military career, he isn't afraid to take chances, and he himself is actually very, very skilled. It's very unusual to understand him, and I don't want to run over my time here, but let me say this about him. He is not trained militarily in terms of his background. He has no particular training before the outbreak of the war. But what he does bring is a determination to and a broad understanding of military strategy. And that is, if you're going to defeat the enemy, you have to think bigger than they do. And you have to be operationally keen. And that's what he is able to do. And he understands that in order to defeat Burgoyne, he must help organize the forces, and unlike General Horatio Gates, he must not let them come to them, but at Bemis Heights in September and October 1777, he must go after them. And that's what he does. He goes on the offensive, and he's very, very effective in convincing the British that they might as well lay down their arms. Now, in the process, he's seriously wounded. That has a real effect on how he looks at the war and his decision to go back over to the British, but that's another story, and I don't really want to go over my time. So,
yeah, okay, Jim. What we'll do is we'll move on to our next speaker. Then at the end,
Okay.
we'll have everybody ask questions.
Great.
And I'd just like to remind the audience, please send your questions through the chat text bar, and Roger will get all the questions over to me. So if you have more questions for Jim on the Saratoga campaign and Burgoyne and Benedict Arnold, please send them to Roger, as well as any you have for our next speaker. All right, and we'll get moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Michael C. Harris. He is a graduate of the University of Mary Washington and the American Military University. He has worked for the National Park Service in Fredericksburg, Virginia, Fort Mott State Park in New Jersey, and the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission at the Brandywine Battlefield. He has conducted tours and staff rides of many East Coast battlefields, and he is the author of 2 books. One being, I had them right here, there we go, Brandywine, A Military History of the Battle that Lost Philadelphia but Saved America, September 11th, 1777, and then his recently released Germantown, A Military History of the Battle for Philadelphia, October 4th, 1777. There we go. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Brian. And also thank you to everybody that decided to tune in tonight. So like Jim, I was asked to write one of those essays for that 10 Key Campaigns book. And mine was on the Philadelphia campaign. Yeah, that book there. But mine was on the Philadelphia campaign. And Jim did a pretty good job of setting up how the armies ended up where they did at the end of 1776, which also ties in with my story, because the Saratoga campaign is happening simultaneously as the Philadelphia campaign in the summer and fall 1777. What the plan was, what should have happened in the spring of 77, is while Burgoyne was moving south from Canada, William Howe should, the British commander in New York, should have sent a column up the Hudson River corridor to meet Burgoyne, which is what they had started to do in 76, did not complete. And that was the general understanding of what was supposed to happen in 1777. How, and we can have a debate on why that doesn't happen, and I cover it in the first book on Brandywine. You could debate why he doesn't do that, but he ultimately doesn't do that. He actually claims initially that he can capture Philadelphia and get back to the Hudson River corridor in time to meet Burgoyne in Albany. But a series of events and decisions that he makes during the course of that campaign will ultimately make that impossible. So his goal is to capture Philadelphia. The shortest way to do that would be to march overland across New Jersey, cross the Delaware River, and capture Philadelphia. There is some initial maneuvering in northern New Jersey, May and June of 1777, with a minor engagement, several smaller engagements, and a little bit larger one at a place called Short Hills in northern New Jersey. But all of this was basically meaningless maneuvering, because ultimately Howe can't get Washington out of the hills of northern New Jersey into an open field fight. So he withdraws the army, the British army, to Staten Island, and starts loading up ships. Ultimately, it's 267 of them, and they're going to go by sea to go get Philadelphia, which there's the first decision that's going to make it hard for him to support Burgoyne. Because going by sea, it's going to take him longer to get back. Now, theoretically, it was still possible to do this at the end of June, early July 1777. So he's going to load about 18,000 personnel onto these ships. And about mid-July, they're going to leave New York Harbor. Now, when they do, Washington and the Continentals aren't really sure where he's going. There isn't much of a Continental Navy, so it's not easy to track the British fleet. They could be going to north back to Boston or Canada. They could be going to south to any number of ports, Charleston, Savannah, not just Philadelphia. See, Washington is almost going to have to play a waiting game in northern New Jersey to wait to see where this fleet shows up. And they're going to have spotters all on the coastline to relay back if they see them. Now, ultimately, the British are going to enter the mouth of Delaware Bay, down where Cape May, New Jersey is. And that's where the ultimate fateful decision, in my opinion, for Burgoyne is going to take place. When they arrive at the mouth of the Delaware, or the Delaware Bay, they meet up with a naval captain by the name of Andrew Hammond, who is going to report on conditions in the Delaware River. Now, at that time, Washington was not across the Delaware River yet. He has moved the army to slightly north of Trenton at this point, but he is not across the Delaware River. There is no troops in Philadelphia. There's some minor Pennsylvania militia at a couple of the river forts, but no significant force. So basically, the forts that protect the city are ungarrisoned or not even done being built yet. There is no Continental Navy. There's some Pennsylvania naval militia, which I'm going to make a joke. They're basically a bunch of rowboats and skiffs. They are not a force that can stop the British fleet from coming up the river. What is in the river are these river obstructions sunk in the river called chevaux de frise. And they would have slowed the fleet down, but the fleet could have still offloaded the army in northern Delaware, Wilmington, or even a little bit north of Wilmington. They don't do that because William Howe had told the British government that he would only go up the Delaware River if Washington was not across the river. Hammond gives a false report. Hammond reports, and he was the naval officer watching the Delaware, that the Americans are across the river, which was wrong. But based on that information, William Howe will take that fleet back out to sea and go all the way around the Delmarva Peninsula and up the Chesapeake Bay. They will spend another month at sea, only to land in northeastern Maryland, roughly 20 miles west of where they could have landed a month before. That decision to go back out to sea dooms Burgoyne, in my opinion. Once he makes that decision, there's no way he's making it back to New York. It's not happening. So I'm going to kind of fast forward here in the interest of time here. So they land in northeastern Maryland, near where Elkton, Maryland is today. It's on August 25th, 1777. It's the same day Washington moves his army from a camp north of Philadelphia down in the Delaware and starts deploying west of Wilmington. You then have a series of maneuvers through northeastern Maryland and northern Delaware, with a minor engagement on September 3rd at a place called Cooch's Bridge. Delaware people, and if there's anybody here from Delaware, good for you, but it's the largest battle in the history of Delaware, but it's not that big a deal. Hate to break it to you all. But it's the only major engagement of the Revolution, or really any war in our history, except for some minor War of 1812 stuff that ever took place in Delaware. So that's September 3rd. That's 8 days before the Battle of Brandywine. After that, again, they're going to kind of parallel each other across the Delaware state line into Pennsylvania, which sets up the Battle of Brandywine, which is basically just across the Delaware border in southeastern Pennsylvania. Again, this is arguable, but I argue it's the largest battle of the war in terms of troops engaged. There's about 31,000 troops engaged. The armies are larger at Long Island, but not all of them are engaged. It's also bigger than Saratoga, it's bigger than Monmouth, it's bigger than Yorktown. Takes up 10 square miles, making it take up more land than any other battle also. So it's a big deal and not that many people wrote about. So when I wrote the first book, again, Brandywine, I really wrote that because there were so many myths surrounding the battle that I wanted dispelled and to give a good tactical history of the battle. That was the goal with that first book, and really wasn't intended to write a second book, and that sort of developed over time. But Brandywine, the first book, really ends 5 days after that battle. It kind of covers the British occupation of the battlefield, and then it kind of ends there. The new book, which Brian mentioned, the Germantown book, which just came out about a month ago, picks up the story where the first book ends. And so that book really starts with the Battle of the Clouds, September 16th. So after Brandywine, Washington's in a dilemma. Gotta keep an eye on the clock here. Washington's in a dilemma. With the loss of the Brandywine River defensive line, the only other natural defensive barrier for the city of Philadelphia is the Schuylkill River. So over the next couple weeks, there's a series of maneuvers and a couple of engagements designed to keep the British south of the Schuylkill River. And if you're familiar with Philadelphia geography today Philadelphia spreads out over both sides of the Schuylkill River. But in the 18th century, the old city part of Philadelphia was on a peninsula formed by the Delaware and the Schuylkill rivers. And so if you could keep the British south of that river, they couldn't get into the city. And so you have a series of maneuvers, the first of which ends up with this Battle of the Clouds, which ends up not being much of a battle because of a massive rainstorm that breaks out, ruining the ammunition of both armies, and kind of negating an engagement that could have been. And I cover that battle pretty extensively, more than previous histories of the campaign. A lot of previously unused sources I used in that. So if you're interested, I have a whole chapter on that battle. And then Washington has to move pretty far west to get new ammunition because of the rain. He leaves a division behind when he does that under Anthony Wayne, behind British lines. The British will find out about that from local loyalists, and they will assault that division on the night of September 21st. It's called the Battle of Paoli, but it actually took place outside the modern town of Malvern. So that's another engagement that takes place before Germantown that I cover in the new book. After that, it basically frees Howe up to maneuver to the Schuylkill River. He feints Washington into thinking he's heading west. Washington moves west, opening up the lower fords, and the British are able to cross the Schuylkill River with nobody between them and the city of Philadelphia at that point. They occupy the village of Germantown, which was a village at the time, about 8 miles outside the city, on September 25th. And on 26th, he sends a column in to occupy the city of Philadelphia, which is it'll begin a 9-month occupation of the city until the following spring. Washington wants to strike. A lot of his officers don't like that idea. So he slowly inches closer to the British camp at Germantown. He gets reinforcements from the Northern Army and some militia units to replace his losses from Brandywine. And then ultimately he gets reports from his spies that Howe's army is basically not as big as it was at Brandywine. Howe had to send a detachment to garrison Wilmington. He sent a garrison or a detachment to garrison the city or the village of Chester on the Delaware River. He also sent a very large detachment to occupy Philadelphia. So the army that was camped at Germantown was a shadow of the army that fought at Brandywine. And that's the army, or that's the portion of the army that Washington will assault on October 4th. With amazingly initial success, everything was going pretty well until Washington had one too many councils of war that convinced him he had to assault this house of Cliveden, that basically a couple of companies of British troops went in, even though all the Americans went past it. And the decision to deal with that rather than keep pushing the attack allowed the British to regroup and counterattack and drive the Americans off of that field. I cover that obviously very extensively in the new book. The new book basically ends right after that, but there's a whole nother phase of the campaign. I'm gonna give you like a 2-minute thing here because I know I'm low on time, which I do intend to do a 3rd volume on. So then it becomes a river war because even though the British have Philadelphia, their navy still can't get to the city to resupply the army. Those river obstructions were still in the river. And now the Americans are starting to send Continental Line troops instead of militia to garrison the forts on the south side of the city, specifically Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer. And so over the next month and a half, roughly, there's a series of operations from the British to get control of the river, get the obstructions out of the river, and capture those two forts. There's a massive assault by Hessian troops on Fort Mercer on October, I think it's 22nd, which is bloodily repulsed. They do not capture Fort Mercer. There's about a month-long siege against Fort Mifflin, which sat on an island at the time. Now you can't see that if you go there because it's basically part of the mainland now. But it was an island at the time that they put under artillery bombardment. And ultimately, the Americans in Fort Mifflin run out of food and ammunition, and there's just no support to them. And they abandoned that fort. I think it's on November 15th, if my memory's working at the moment. They abandon it. They don't actually surrender. They leave the flag flying and row across the river to New Jersey to abandon it, which forces the abandonment of Fort Mercer. And that's when they're ultimately able to get the fleet into Philadelphia to resupply the army. The only other major event that occurs prior to Valley Forge is Howe will make one last effort to bring Washington to a general engagement. On December 7th and 8th, he marches out of Philadelphia, and you have a minor engagement in an area known as White Marsh, northwest of the city. Again, nothing really plays out from that. It's a very minor action, and that's really it. After that, they both go into winter quarters, the British in Philadelphia, and the Americans at Valley Forge, which everybody knows about the Valley Forge in Kansas. So that's a very general overview of the campaign, but I'd be happy to take any questions anybody might have.
Okay, thank you to both speakers, and we'll get started. We got a bunch of questions that came in while you both were talking. The first question to Jim would be, what problems did disease play in Burgoyne's difficulties at Quebec?
In Burgoyne's difficulties?
Yeah, at Quebec, yeah.
Interesting, because I think of disease as a major problem for the Americans, not for the British at this point in time. The Americans, the smallpox is the greatest enemy. That disease breaks out as the Americans are actually before Quebec in November, late November, early December 1775. In fact, there's some opinion out there that Lord Dunmore actually sent people with disease out of the walled city of Quebec and into the American camp to help spread the disease. But disease becomes really the American problem. Overall, the Brits are much better, are much more immune to all of these problems, and it has something to do with health and care. They're just much better at taking care of themselves and understanding appropriate camp conditions. But as the Americans retreat out of Canada, smallpox and all sorts of other diseases, including dysentery and various other horrible diseases, break out. There's an island in the Richelieu River, Illinois, and that's my, per French, I guess, an operation. But the Americans sort of pile up on that island as they're retreating in June of 1776, and they die there by the hundreds. There are burial pits. There's no, I've been there a couple of times, there's no marker today, but they die by the hundreds, mostly because of the diseases that I've described. And they will continue to retreat. And what they will do is the Americans will retreat all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga, estimated about 100 miles south of there. And they will actually begin to separate those with disease out, and they'll send them farther away to the southern end of Lake George, where there is a hospital operation to try to save some of these lives. But disease really is more an American rather than a British problem at this point in time. It's something the Americans really do have to work to overcome because it very much affects their manpower availability.
Okay, thank you, Jim. This one's from Mike. Can you explain how the news of Paoli affected the morale of the Americans? Remember the Paoli?
That's a good question. I don't know if I would say it sunk their spirits. I wouldn't say that. I would say that the Pennsylvania line troops are going to use it as a rallying cry when they get another chance. There's some evidence, the 1st Brigade in at Germantown, which is about 2 weeks after Paoli, is Thomas Conway's brigade. Now that's not one of Anthony Wayne's brigades that was at Paoli, but there's some evidence that they were chanting "Remember Paoli" or something about Paoli when they went in. They were the 1st Brigade in. And there's definitely evidence that when Wayne's division went in a little later in the morning at Germantown, that they were shouting to revenge the Paoli. And the irony is the unit that those 3 brigades hit are the 2nd Light Infantry Battalion, which opened the fight at Paoli. So it was literally revenge against the same unit, and they overran their camp. So I would say it was used in a positive way. I wouldn't say it had a negative effect on the Army.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Yep.
All right, next question's for Jim. The Nathaniel Batchelor letter that runs against the conventional idea that Arnold was reckless and insubordinate to Horatio Gates when he leads the charge at Saratoga. Do you believe the letter? And if not, why not?
Well,
I didn't plant that question.
No, okay. I was wondering there because I think some folks know I'm no big advocate of the importance of this letter, and I'll give you 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, it's the only evidence anywhere these guys got along at all during the battle. Number 2, there's no reason to assume that Nathaniel Batchelor even knew who Benedict Arnold was. And you start to have, you don't have corroborating evidence, and in the context, I mean, Arnold and Gates are at each other's throats, and suddenly to say that just before the 2nd battle, they were cooperating and getting along together, and Arnold didn't break into the field without Gates's permission, just doesn't fit the bigger story. Now, I know that there is another side to this, and that folks, particularly Eric Schnitzer, is an outstanding historian, affiliated at Saratoga, believes very much in this story and has sort of been rewriting the 2nd battle and the story of the 2nd battle around this particular letter. And what Batchelor said, I guess I should have pointed that out, is that Arnold and Gates were actually cooperating together, and Gates sort of said, yeah, get out there and get him again and all this kind of stuff. But if you look at the whole story, it just doesn't fit. And that's the way I have to look at it contextually. And so that's why I'm not a big fan, although I try to respect those who are a big fan, and it will be a point of, actually, I think, fairly significant disagreement in understanding the battle and the way everything shaped out.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Let's see, next question is for Mike. How did the Army protect its ammunition at other times during these battles?
Try to think how I want to answer that. The rain is such an issue for the American Army because the cartridge boxes are not made as well as the British cartridge boxes. It's going to get kind of technical, especially if somebody's not familiar, but later wars and the British boxes have a much larger flap, or sometimes even a double flap, which means there's less likely that wind-driven rain can blow into the side of the cartridge box and ruin this ammunition. And maybe I should explain. Ammunition back then is not like modern ammunition. It's not like a copper jacketed bullet that's impervious to wet. This ammunition, the gunpowder, is in a paper tube with a round ball, and it's just sort of folded over or tied with string. So if that paper gets wet, the gunpowder gets wet, and it's no good. So the poor infrastructure of the Continental Army leads to this problem. Now, previous battles, you don't have a massive rainstorm you're trying to fight in. This was like a tropical storm. This might have been either a tropical storm or something on the edge of a hurricane. They wouldn't have called it back then, but this was wind-driven rain. And that's why it was such an issue. It wasn't like a drizzle. And so the poor infrastructure of the American Army, they weren't making high-quality articles of equipment. So it was just make what we can to supply these guys, and they weren't making high-quality cartridge boxes like the British Army carried. And so that's why the ammunition was easily exposed to wind-driven rain. That kind of, I guess that answers the question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Yep.
Okay, next question is for Jim. Did Benedict Arnold know history? Did he see himself as a General Mack who brokered, I might have said that name wrong, but who brokered the restitution of the monarchy after the English Civil War?
Well, I think there is something to that, although I can't say that Arnold saw himself literally as Mack, but Arnold did see himself as I wrote, I don't know, 30 years ago, maybe even longer, in an essay, as sort of a renegade from republicanism. And that is that the leadership of the revolution had really failed the cause because of the way they were handling the issues of the day, everything from paper currency, the loss of the value of money, to the way they were treating the army. Arnold wrote very, very specifically about the failure of the country to support the Continental Army. And these were all part of the doubts that he will have in his mind that will build over time based on actually on his experiences in Canada and retreating out of Canada. So from one interpretation, which I think has some merit, he begins to see himself sort of as a Pied Piper. And that is, the cause is failing. It is in bad shape in 1779 and 1780. Popular participation is reaching an all-time low, and he sees himself more and more as an individual. While I'm going to benefit from this situation, which I'm not going to deny, he sees himself as an individual that can become a reconciliationist within the empire. In other words, it becomes, if I could put it this way, in his mind, in 75, this guy's the most enthusiastic of the rebels out there. And he's the total super patriot, if we could put it that way. And over a period of time, his enthusiasm wears down and wears out based on his experiences. He feels that he's been mistreated. He feels that others have been mistreated. They're not appreciated. The American leadership is not up to snuff. And the best thing I can do is now become an individual having committed treason once, will go ahead and do it a second time and go back over to the British and become that Pied Piper. I've worked with Mark Lender on Arnold's post-treason activities as a British officer, and it's very, very clear that in his campaign into Virginia, which we don't have time to get into, that he sees himself in that role as an individual, not trying to burn Richmond, but trying to convince, which is a different story, but actually trying to convince individuals the cause is lost and come back over and let's reconcile with the empire. Usually that side is not explored in his story. It's much more a matter of Peggy made him do it, or he was greedy, or the devil got loose in the land, that sort of thing. But actually, it's a little more complex than all of that, I would like to argue.
All right, thank you, Jim. Okay, make sure I'm on mute. Okay, there we go. Thank you. The next question is for Mike. Did Fort Mott and Fort Mercer in southern New Jersey have any bearing on getting the British out of Philadelphia? Was there any concern about the Continental Army being so close across the river?
Well, Fort Mott didn't exist yet. Fort Mott is a Endicott era battery just prior to the Spanish-American War, so that one wasn't there. So what was there was Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer, and then there was also another fort, Billingsport, slightly downriver on the New Jersey side that most people don't know about because it gets captured earlier in the campaign on October 2nd. I do cover that in the new book. Now, the whole reason, Washington's whole thought process after Germantown is to starve the British out of Philadelphia. Throughout the campaign, there's actually orders in Washington's papers. He orders the grinding stones removed from grist mills as they're retreating. The reasoning being is that the British can't grind grain. So if they can't get their fleet of resupply to the city and they can't produce their own grain, eventually they're going to run out of food. That was the plan. So after Germantown, Washington kind of gets into a holding pattern on these series of hills northwest of the city to kind of keep the British hemmed in on that peninsula I described earlier, that peninsula formed by the Delaware and the Schuylkill Rivers. Then the whole key becomes holding those two forts. Fort Mifflin, which was on the Pennsylvania side, south of what's today, Now it's in the city, but at the time it was south of the city. And Fort Mercer, which is directly east of it on the New Jersey side. So if they could hold those forts, the British could not remove those river obstructions that were in the river between those two forts, and therefore they couldn't get their fleet of resupply ships into the city docks. So that was the whole point. Now, Washington does take a risk, but he's also not risking the whole Continental Army in those two forts. They're relatively small detachments. I think at any given time, it was a total of 4 regiments rotating through there. So we're not talking about the whole army. The main army was safe, relatively safe on those hills northwest of the city. So it was a calculated strategy to see if they could hold out long enough to force the British to give up the city through starvation. That was the strategy. It just doesn't play out because he couldn't get enough supply and troops long-term to hold those forts through the winter.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Yep.
Here's another question for yourself. You didn't mention the complexity of George Washington's battle plan at Germantown as a factor in the outcome of the battle. Given that issue, do you think his army could have succeeded in that battle if it hadn't been for other factors that impacted the engagement? For example, the obsession with capturing the stone house and the fog that created confusion among various American units.
All right, yeah, there's kind of a couple questions there. So start with the first question, the complex attack plan. It is exceptionally complicated. One of the things you gotta remember about the Army of 77, it's not a professional force yet. Remember the enlistments of 76 were 1 year. So that's why Trenton and Princeton are such a big deal. The Army was disintegrating because all those enlistments were expired. So all throughout the spring and summer and fall, they're literally building a new army almost from scratch. A lot of the recruits had not fought in 76, and they haven't really been through professional training yet. That all happens at Valley Forge. So when you think about, keep that in the back of your mind, and then he comes up with this plan to send 5 separate columns on 5 different roads in the middle of the night to strike a British camp simultaneously from 5 different directions at the same time. The shocking thing is the Army pulled that off. Within maybe 10 minutes of each other, every column hit where they were supposed to and when they were supposed to. So the complex battle plan was not the problem. I would argue against that. And they actually had success. They collapsed all the British outposts and picket posts. The supports that came to those outposts were driven back. James Grant's division on the northern side of the village was absolutely crushed and driven in. The only troops that they did not totally crush was Kniphausen's division on the south side of the Germantown Road. But that could have, now again, this is a what if. I mean, nobody knows for sure, but that could have happened. Because the plan was there was a reserve division that was not initially engaged that was supposed to rotate to the front and replace the units running out of ammunition and continue the attack. That does not happen because that division gets used in the attack on Clifton. So I argue, yes, there was smoke, yes, there was fog, confusion, that is all true. You could also argue that there was drunken officers giving bad orders, but despite all of those complexities and issues, they were achieving success. Now, whether that fresh division could have completely driven the entire British Army in, who knows, because it never happens. But what I do know is the decision to not replace those troops on the front and do this attack in the rear of those units in the front caused those frontline units to run out of ammunition, to hear the engagement in the rear. Now remember, in the smoke and the confusion, they don't know who they left behind them. So they start filtering to the rear, and then you have all these friendly fire incidents. And when all that starts, the British are able to regroup, distribute regiments to create a new line, and then surge back and retake everything they lost. So I know that was a complex question, but that was a complex question. There was multiple parts to that. So hopefully that answered that.
Well, good. Thank you, Mike. Okay, this next question actually is for both authors. We'll start with Jim. How was the news of these battles received by other nations, including the French?
Well, that's a very good question, very important question, because campaigns have consequences. And there's no doubt about this in the Saratoga campaign that it has lasting consequences in terms of actually changing the nature of the Revolutionary War. Because, back up here just a little bit, the French are already involved. They're just under the table. They're not out in public. They're really supporting the Americans. One of the things that we know is that the French actually sent a whole host of military supplies to Portsmouth just north of Boston in the New Hampshire area. And those supplies were carried overland to support, and supplies were actually used by the American army to help defeat the British. You capture a whole British army, it's a devastating blow in military warfare in the 18th century. No, you've not captured the enemy's capital like you need to do in Europe, but capturing an army is very significant. And that action, actually, along with some of the backward success that Washington had, let's say at Germantown, because it wasn't really a complete defeat, helps convince the French, especially their leadership, what is that gentleman's name? It's not, it's Vergennes, the Comte de Vergennes. And the Comte de Vergennes says, this is the proof we needed. The Americans can stand on their own. That's very, very significant, because that will lead to a decision that if the Americans can stand by themselves, let's support them. Let's give them naval support, let's give them military support, let's give them additional material support, and that's going to prove a critical difference. The French do come out in the open. In 1778, there's a treaty system that is worked out. A naval battle will occur in June of 1777 in the English Channel. The British declare war on the French and the British and the Americans become, with the French now, the French, they become good and faithful allies. Why is this really significant? Because it changes the whole nature of this war. Simply put, it had been a civil war within an empire. It has now just become an international war stretching beyond the British empires, and it is really now evolved into a world war that will spread into other parts of the globe before it's all said and done. In many ways, if the British had a chance before Saratoga, they're in real trouble, beginning in 1778 and into 1779, and their southern campaign doesn't pull it out for them. It's a last desperate struggle, and they'll lose another army that in 1781, and the whole thing will now lead to British defeat. So really important campaign. This campaign is really very significant. I agree too, by the way, that the Germantown plays a role in all of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, Jim just nailed it. I don't even need to say anything. I mean, basically, I could just say that I know from my research that Ben Franklin, who's helping negotiate the treaty, and Comte de Vergennes, if I'm saying his name properly, they both reference Germantown as being as important as the Saratoga victory, because it proved that Washington could fight too, and not just one of his subsidiary armies.
Good point.
Good.
Yeah.
All right, thank you both. Jim, this question's for you. After his defection, Arnold wrote publicity about the concessions offered by the British mediators as a justification for his going over to their side. Example, that the Americans had effectively achieved what they sought by rebelling, I can't even talk, sorry, not independence, but compelling British to abandon their efforts to tax the colonies. Do you think this was really a sincere factor in his thinking, or just a way to rationalize his defection in the minds of Americans generally?
Well, it probably was both, if I could summarize it that way, because I've already sort of gotten a little bit into his attitude, this Pied Piper thing. You know, the Americans are stupid to keep this thing going. Ultimately, and it really misreads the circumstances, given what we've just described in terms of French involvement. He really misreads it. A real blunder on his part, but he sees the cause is lost, and so he's going to come up with various kinds of arguments as to why the Americans should give it up. one of the things that comes up about Arnold, that he was part of his thinking that he really couldn't handle the French. He thought so poorly of them and that sort of thing. I'm not sure that's a factor that, I think, let me restate that. It's a factor that's been overblown about his thinking. I'm not sure that's a critical factor. What the critical factor is, he didn't appreciate what he had helped accomplish. And that is real irony when you think about it. Mm-hmm. That what his actions did, even though he himself is seriously wounded, will limp the rest of his life, so on and so forth, what he did really mattered. And in a certain sense, the worst decision that he made was a decision that he thought was the best he could do for the American cause. And again, that's further irony in the situation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. Let's see, last question here says, and we'll toss this one to you, Mike. Washington was outflanked at the Battle of Long Island and again at Brandywine. He also fought in the 7 Years' War. Was this due to being a poor field general or due to bad luck?
All right, everybody take a deep breath. Washington is bad on a battlefield. Everybody take a deep breath. He's not a good general, not a good battlefield general. The flanking maneuver at Brandywine was the 7th time it was done to him. It wasn't a new concept, and he never seemed to figure it out. Now, that said, the reason Washington's great and the reason he makes a great president is because through all the bad stuff that Army goes through, the Army never collapses. The Army never falls apart. And that's important because the Congress, the Continental Congress, and then ultimately the Confederation Congress are utterly incapable of functioning. So the Army is the symbol of the revolution. And if at any point the Army had fallen apart, the revolution would have fallen apart. And if that's not true, why did we have to write a constitution after the war to build a new system of government? It was because the form of government we created during the war was no good. So that's why Washington's great, is that he held it together through all the bad. Remember, he only won twice, Trenton and Princeton. And Yorktown doesn't happen without the French fleet.
That's true.
All right, so just take a deep breath. It's okay, but he's bad on a battlefield.
He did make a few mistakes. We could put soften the blow.
Whoops, Jim, did you want to add anything to that?
About Washington?
Yeah.
His brilliance, from my point of view, isn't so much as a commander in the field, but it's his ability to handle everything else. I can put it this way. This guy put up with more, whatever you want to call it, and you know the word I'm thinking of, than perhaps anybody in the history of warfare. The problems are just unbelievable. To keep that army together was, in many ways, an incredible miracle. And to understand, and the great quality about Washington, when you strip it all away, is that he has incredible power. He could have become a dictator. He could have become our first version of Napoleon, that sort of thing. But while he handled power, he always handled it very, very delicately. And in the end, his greatest accomplishment was to help bring about a freedom-loving republic dedicated to the law instead of the will of one or very few leaders. And that's an accomplishment in and of itself that we should be forever grateful for, at least we Americans, from my point of view.
Well said.
Well, that's terrific, and I'm really thrilled. It's a great way to end it, Jim. Thank you. I would like to thank James Kirby Martin and Michael Harris for their presentations. I would like to thank Brian Mack of the Fort Plain Museum for his stewardship in answering the question and answer period. And I remind everyone that if you go to fortplainmuseum.com, look at the gift shop, you'll find our authors' books and many fine books on the American Revolution. I would love to let you all know and remind you that you should look at historyauthortalks.com. Our next show is, we're going back to Tuesday. I thank you for tuning in on Thursday. Michael Harris is also, I guess it's a scoutmaster.
Den leader.
Den leader, there you go.
I'm an Eagle Scout.
So that's why this show was on Thursday. But next Tuesday, we have David Stewart, who is the author of the historical novel Paris Deception, along with a couple of other novelists. We're going to be talking about the novel in history, or the history in novels, you know. So I think it's going to be a very interesting show, and we're certainly thrilled to have David Stewart along with Tom Young and Eric Denzenhall for that show coming up this Tuesday. Then on the 27th, we have Mark Lender. Jim Martin mentioned Mark Lender earlier, and Mark Lender along with Christian McBurney are going to be talking about the Monmouth campaign, and that's on Tuesday, October 27th. So that's just a few of the shows that we have coming up. Michael Harris is going to be joining us again in mid-November, where we are going to have Michael joined with Jim McIntyre, who's going to be talking about Johann Ewald, who was a very interesting character that taught us a lot about the revolution. He was a Jager commander. So, and keep tuning in to to historyauthortalks.com for further shows. And I thank you all, obviously the audience, for tuning in. And I very much appreciate your spending this hour with us. So we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.